It's really lovely to be here today, looking out into this sea of women leaders. I do need to ask, are there any men in the audience? You're very, very welcome. But here you all are, at different stages of your careers and coming from all sorts of different parts of the civil service. What I'm going to do today is talk to you a bit about finding myself as a leader, how I'd like to redefine success, and a little bit about red shoelaces. I just want to start with some really obvious success, though, which is these conferences themselves. FDA and Dodds are to be really congratulated on the way in which they have sustained and grown the Women into Leadership conferences. I do remember running breakouts at the early conferences when they used to be small enough to be held in a building in Victoria Street. And they were always buzzing with energy like today, but they were on a very, very much smaller scale. And now there are Women into Leadership conferences around the UK, and today's amazing event with 850 people. Just say that to yourself, 850 people here in the room. Now, in the last couple of years, I've spoken at Women into Leadership events in Leeds and in Cardiff, but the last time I was here at the London conference was in 2015. And I was then only a few weeks into my role as the Permanent Secretary at DEFRA. And as it happened, I spoke here on the 30th anniversary of my joining the civil service. And I reflected then on just how long it had taken for me to understand what it meant to be a leader. Both the idea that being a leader was my role, and also thinking about how I did it and what I wanted to do with it. I was a full 20 years into my career before I really focused on leadership as what I was there for. The light bulb moment came when, after 20 years, I moved from the Department of Health to what's now the Ministry of Justice, and I lost all the subject knowledge that I'd built up over 20 years overnight. And I had to work out what I was going to do with my time. Fortunately, I inherited a directorate which had lots and lots of cross-cutting initiatives about growing the organisation. And I discovered that supporting those was both fun and rewarding. I discovered that talking to people individually and in groups, helping them to grow, helping them to realise just how much they could do, often more than they realised, was actually real work after all, because it helped the directorate perform to the best of our abilities, as well as being something which gave me a great deal of fulfilment. So by the time I finished that job, I was sold on leadership. I'd redefined myself as somebody who did stuff and knew stuff, to somebody who made it possible for other people to do stuff. And I tumbled then on the definition which remains my favourite ever definition of leadership, which I keep coming back to, which is making it possible for other people to do their best work. But increasingly, I'm thinking it's not just enough for me to be a leader. I need to decide what I'm going to do with my leadership. How I'm going to position myself, what's the difference that I want to make as a leader? What does success look like for me? And I suppose that's been the theme of the last 10 years or so, and it will remain the theme, I think, for as long as I'm a civil servant. So when I spoke here 3 years ago, I did define a success measure, recognising that, as I say, I've been a bit slow working some of this stuff out. I try now, through mentoring individuals, through engagement with groups, through talking to larger groups like you, I help other people to get more quickly than me to the conclusions that it's taken me so long to arrive at. And 3 years ago, I distilled that learning into 3 important lessons. One of them was about accentuating the positive. We all have a natural tendency, and I think it is a bit more pronounced in women possibly than in men, to hear the negatives in feedback and to spend lots of time trying to think about how we fix the things that aren't quite working, the areas where people say to us, well, you could be a bit better at that. Important thing to do, no doubt, but actually much more bang for buck than recognising the things that we're really, really good at and finding ways to build on them, to create the flywheel, to build on success. So that's a message which I constantly promote to people. The second distillation was about spending time on what matters. And particularly, I was talking in the context of that perennial thorny question, particularly again for women, about work-life balance. How do we combine whatever responsibilities we may have outside work? For many of those, that is about children, but it may be about elderly parents, it may be all sorts of different things. How do we combine them with having fulfilling careers and making the best of our potential? And the third one was about being yourself, but with the important rider, be yourself, but don't expect other people to be like you. Now, those three distillations are still things which I think are really important. I keep coming back to them. Some of them develop over time. I still think that spending time on the things that matter is really, really important. But I suppose I've developed that a bit. One of the things I say to people a lot at the moment is, do only what you can do. Do only what only you can do. There's always a tendency, particularly as we progress in an organisation, to fall back on the things that feel a bit familiar. Then we end up doing somebody else's job. That's frustrating to them. It also means that the job that only we can do is often not being done. But if that's where I was in September 2015, those three messages: accentuate the positive, spend time on what matters, be yourself, and don't expect others to be like you. Where's the last 3 years taken me? Well, it's taken me on a voyage of discovery around DEFRA and inevitably around Brexit. It is amazing what the DEFRA group is responsible for. We look after nature reserves and illegal waste sites. We're responsible for applied marine research and also antimicrobial resistance, both the AMRs. And just to take a few topical examples, we're responsible for ivory sales, for scallop wars, and for decontamination after nerve agents. There was a big inflection point for us with the referendum result in 2016. I quite often say that DEFRA is the domestic department most affected by Brexit, and although I must now have said this several hundred times, nobody has yet challenged me for that exciting title. Brexit for us has put the spotlight on a new range of issues. They were part of our responsibilities, but they were things that kind of went on in the background and which now are very much in front of mind for us. So we spend a lot of time thinking about chemicals regulation, trade in endangered species, and biosecurity at the border. Making sure that there is going to be food on the shelves is probably my single most important responsibility at the moment. We have a huge portfolio of EU exit projects. We have legislation coming out of our ears, we have big operational issues to deal with, and we've got lots and lots more people in DEFRA than we used to have. And that's been testing for me as a leader. From the day after the referendum, when I needed to stand up in front of my colleagues, all of whom had spent years of their lives working with the EU, and try and find sensible things to say about what the future world might be and when we might understand what it was. It's been testing as we've had to change as a department, holding on to our traditional skills in areas like negotiation, but adding on and developing really big muscles in the area of project delivery. It's been testing as we've grown by over 40% in the central department in the course of a year, finding ways to make DEFRA welcoming to people who've joined and learning how to operate across different locations. And through all of that, the question running in the back of my head has been, okay, so there's all this stuff that you need to do, but how do I want to lead? Where do I want to make a difference? And the two words I keep coming back to are open and inclusive. So open's kind of been my watchword since I joined DEFRA in 2015. And it started with a commitment that had been made by the then Secretary of State Liz Truss to release 8,000 data sets in the course of a year. It was a particularly interesting commitment I discovered when I arrived, because actually nobody knew if we had 8,000 data sets. It was a bold, ambitious commitment. And it drove a different type of behaviour. It was really interesting. By the end of the year, we had actually, good news, released about 10,000 data sets, some of which were quite small, some of which were actually huge. But what was really interesting for me was that actually opening the data, people have done fantastic stuff with that data, but opening the data was only best half the issue. Much more important was the effect it had on the way that we worked, working between colleagues among the many different organisations that make up the DEFRA group, and the way that we worked with our external partners, from universities to charities to commercial organisations. It opened up. In opening our data, we opened up the way that we worked. That led us to some really interesting discussions about open government. What does it mean to be accountable while also being open? And how do we use a much greater focus on working openly to plug into user-centered design? So there were some quite big questions about how we were as a department that came out of talking about open. But it also took us into questions about how we could be more open as individuals, sharing a bit more about ourselves. When you start a job in a new organisation, it's a great opportunity to reinvent yourself. And I decided on day one in DEFRA that when I went round and did little talks on the floors of the building, that rather than saying, I'm Claire Moriarty, I used to work in the Department for Transport and now I'm here, I would say, I'm Claire Moriarty, I'm married, I have 2 children, 3 stepchildren and a dog, and I like spending time in these type of places. Talking in that way was, it was a tiny change in a sense in terms of words, but it signalled that this is how I wanted us to be operating, about working, about being open, making connections with other people. Connections are the bedrock on which we build respect for other people and we build trust, and that's when organisations work best. But open has all sorts of dimensions, being open to challenge, being open to new experiences, to new ideas and to difference. And that bit about being open to difference links to my other key word, inclusive. I think inclusive's become it's one of those words that people bandy around a lot now, and I'm delighted to see it appearing more frequently, but I am also concerned that we make sure that we retain the essence of inclusion. DEFRA published, the DEFRA group, we published an Equality, Diversity and Inclusion strategy at the beginning of 2017, and somebody put into it on the front page this fantastic phrase, diversity is the mix and inclusion is making the mix work. And I thought that was absolutely brilliant, a really nice way of summing it up. So I managed to plant that phrase into the Civil Service Diversity and Inclusion strategy, which appeared about a year ago. So if you look hard, you will find it there. And there's a sense that now that type of phrase is everywhere. There are different versions of it. One of them is diversity is being invited to the dance, and inclusion is about being invited to dance. And I love that concept, but I'm quite conscious there's a danger that we slide into lip service where we're talking about inclusion without necessarily going back to what does it mean to us emotionally. So what's important to me about inclusion? I'm going to use 2 slightly technical terms. One of them is unconscious bias, and the other is the deficit model. And some of you will be very familiar with those terms, and some of you may be less. So what do I mean by those? Unconscious bias is about the assumptions that we make that are so deeply ingrained that we don't notice them anymore. There's a chap called Binna Kandola who is a real expert on unconscious bias, and I've heard him talk about the way in which you can research it and see it manifest. And my favourite bit of research, they got a group of volunteers and they said to the volunteers, we want you to go and collect a visitor from reception. And half the volunteers, they said, we want you to go and get a visitor from reception. And the other half, they said, we want you to go and get an elderly visitor from reception. Now, it was the same person in reception each time one of the volunteers went to get them. But what they discovered was not only, if you said to people, please go and collect your elderly visitor from reception, that they walked more slowly with the same visitor than they did if they were just told it was a visitor. The really weird bit is they walked more slowly when they went to collect the visitor. That is just bizarre. But it's to do with, that word, it's triggering a set of assumptions about what people can and can't do. And we're making those assumptions all the time. We all do it. There's no way that we can, there's no point thinking that we can kind of rid ourselves of unconscious bias. The only thing that we can do is to recognise that it may be happening and to think about how we can counter it. The other bit that I keep coming back to with inclusion is about the deficit model. So the deficit model essentially is about saying the norm is the right way of doing things, and we can help you, if you are not somebody who looks like the norm, we can help you be more like the norm, and that will be good because that will allow you to progress. But it's about assuming that if people are not progressing, if people from a particular group are not progressing in an organisation, it's to do with them and not to do with the system. And so the way in which we're going to make it possible for them to progress is to fix the people, not fix the system. And when you combine those two together, if you take the unconscious biases and then you have the deficit model, then the constant danger we are in is of trying to fit people into a norm. Often very, very kindly meant, lots and lots of good intentions, but the opposite of inclusive. So let me tell you a little bit about my story. So I call myself part of the 20% generation. When I came into the civil service as a fast streamer, women were 20% of the fast stream. When I went into the senior civil service, women were 20% of the senior civil service. When I became a permanent secretary, you guessed it, women were 20% of the permanent secretary group. So I've had that experience of being a minority as a woman. But you know what? I'm middle class, I'm white, I'm straight, I'm non-disabled. So other than the woman bit, you could say that I'm very establishment. Except for a tendency to think a bit differently and to name the elephant in the room. So when I went to the Ministry of Justice, I got a really lucky break. They asked me to chair a group thinking about how we could implement the then new civil service model of leadership. Fantastic, I thought. Here's an opportunity to pop the cork from underneath and make some change happen. But I went out a bit of a limb. I tried to be a bit open with my peers. I tried talking about how I felt. And quite quickly I found that branch was sawn off, and I fell promptly onto the ground. And I found that what worked with my team, in terms of a different way of leading, didn't go down that well with my superiors. So overall, it was a learning experience, but not one I desperately wanted to repeat. I went to DfT in a privileged position as a Director General, but I still sometimes felt that I was talking a different language. I was talking people, while my colleagues were talking task. In every leadership group I was part of, we always got to the bit in the end where we shared our Myers-Briggs profiles, and I was an F, and everyone else was a T. So now we come to the red shoelaces. I did some serious reflection before I became a permanent secretary. I was on a development program. I had lots of conversations with well-meaning people who really, really wanted to help me get on. Boiled down, their message was, we're sure you can do it, but you need to conform a bit more before you can get through that door. And my message was, you know what, I think I've conformed enough. The metaphor I had for it was about clothing. So the idea I had in my head was I'd started off in colourful clothes, and over time, gradually, I'd swapped things out. So I'd ended up looking really quite sober in my clothing. But the only colourful bit left was my bright red shoelaces. So these were metaphorical bright red shoelaces, I hasten to add. But still, people would say to me, can you not just take out those pesky red shoelaces just long enough to get through the door, and then you can put them back in again, and it'll be fine. And my answer was, I'm not going to do that. If those red shoelaces come out, I just don't believe that I'm ever going to be able to get them back in again. And they were half right, and I was half right. So I never did take out my red shoelaces. And somehow, I did manage to get through the door and become a permanent secretary with my red shoelaces still on. So I think it was right not to take them out. But it has been possible, on the other side of the door, as a permanent secretary, to add back more colour, so to have slightly more red about my person. Some of the things I thought would be barriers turned out not to be. So they were right about that. But that worries me too, because it shouldn't be easier to be different as a permanent secretary than it is for anybody else in the civil service. And now that really drives where I stand as a leader. I think my first job, given that I do have influence as a permanent secretary, is to use it to good effect, trying to counteract the normative tendency. So everywhere I go, I try to give the same message that people are valued as they are, not for the bits that most fit into a predetermined mould. There is good research evidence that people from different backgrounds are praised in performance management reviews for the things they do that are most like the norm. That doesn't feel right to me. So one of the things I've done is campaigned against the injunction to women to be more confident. Because when we say to women, women should be more confident, we don't actually mean women should be more confident. We mean, confident women, please can you look more like confident men? Because then we can deal with you. So trying to counter those tendencies. I'm also a great fan of hashtag bring yourself to work. Lots of us talk about it a lot of the time. The other day I found a tweet from somebody called Joby Hollis, who is a postdoc at NASA working on the Mars 2020 mission. And I cannot improve on the way that in well under 280 characters, this tweet sums it up. So Joby Hollis says, I've had quite a few people ask why my sexuality is relevant to being a scientist. Having a rainbow flag doesn't make me better at spectroscopy, but being open about who I am makes me a happier person, and I have more energy for my work. So if anybody ever says, why is it important for us to bring ourselves to work? That seems to me to be a really, really good answer. That's why I'm a signed-up LGBT ally, giving visible support so that people can be more comfortable being open about who they are. Similarly, encouraging people who feel able to talk about mental health issues to do that. It's not for me to tell other people to be more open. I'm quite clear about that. I can choose how much of myself I'm going to reveal. It's not for me to tell anybody else what they should do. But it is for me as a leader to create an environment where people who do want to be open find that it's a positive and not a negative experience. So as I say, my first job is to use my influence to good effect. But the second, and even more important, is to share that influence and not hoard it. So I go around now saying quite openly, my mission is to change the civil service. I can't do it on my own, and so I'm constantly looking to encourage agents of change. Sometimes I think the most useful thing I can do as a civil servant in a senior position is to nurture rebels. So rebels, importantly, don't confuse rebels with cynics. But rebels are people who are trying to improve, change, and innovate at work, regardless of whether they have a formal position of authority. There's another really good term that I've come across, which is tempered radicals, also known as boat rockers. So tempered radicals are people who change their organisations not through revolution, but through walking the tightrope between conformity and rebellion. So those rebels, those boat rockers, those temper radicals, they're valuable people. They deserve to be cherished. They're taking risks for change. They're often not in positions of formal authority, so it may be more difficult for them to wear the red shoelaces or the red hat or the red jumper than it is for me. But just think what they can do with a bit more license. And I'm sure that there are people in the room today who are in that category. 850 women is an amazing sample. If my maths is right, that is equivalent to 0.5% of the entire women in the civil service. So you are a big enough sample that every possible type of woman is going to be here today. And there are bound to be change agents among you. I'm completely confident of that. And there are people in this room who will be permanent secretaries, who will be director generals, who will be chief executives of agencies and arm's length bodies. There are people who will find your leadership role outside the civil and public service, and there'll be people who actually may not be destined to be positional or hierarchical leaders, but you will lead in other ways, and you'll make a difference. I really do want to make it possible for more women to progress to senior roles. My main purpose in coming to talk to you today is to say you can succeed without conforming in every way. It is possible to get on without taking out your red shoelaces. And for me, that's what redefining success looks like. Success is when we're not saying to people, please conform, please take out the red shoelaces. We're saying you are whole people and you bring different things, and that is what we value. But the other thing, finally, I'm going to leave you with is wherever you are on your journey, you can be a leader if you want to make a difference. And it is a responsibility on all of us to decide how we want to make a difference and then to go for it. Thank you.